The lock on the door was not broken. It was bolted from the inside. Outside, on the rain-slicked Rue Bruyère, a husband waited, his unease growing with every silent tick of the clock. He had called for the police. He knew his wife and daughter were in there. He knew their maids were in there too. But the house at number 6, a respectable bourgeois home in the French city of Le Mans, was a tomb. It answered his calls with a profound, unnerving silence. The only light was a faint, solitary glow from a small window on the top floor. The maid's room. When the officers finally forced their way through a back door, a heavy, metallic smell greeted them. The smell of a butcher's shop. On the landing, sprawled in a grotesque tableau of violence, lay the bodies of Madame Lancelin and her daughter, Geneviève. Their faces were gone. Their eyes, once windows to their souls, were now just gruesome relics, placed nearby on a fold of carpet. The walls were splattered with the story of their end. Upstairs, the police found the source of the light. The door to the attic room was also locked. They broke it down. And there, in the soft glow of a single candle, lay 2 sisters, naked, in each other's arms, on a clean bed. They were Christine and Léa Papin, their maids. And on a nearby chair, covered in gore, lay the instrument of the carnage. A hammer, a kitchen knife, and a pewter pot, its weight perfect for crushing bone. When the police commissioner asked them what had happened, the older sister, Christine, answered without emotion, her voice as calm as a frozen lake. "It was us." They confessed immediately, not with remorse, but with a chilling shared clarity. They had done their work. They had tidied up. They had washed the tools of their trade, and they had gone to bed. This is not just the story of a crime. It is the story of a silence that festered for decades in the forgotten corners of French society, in the cold dormitories of convents, and in the suffocating stillness of a master's house. It is the story of 2 sisters who created a world so small, so complete, that when it was threatened, they tore the real world apart to protect it. This is the story of how love, twisted by poverty and fear, can become the most terrifying weapon of all. Before the blood, before the headlines, there was the mud. There was the grim, damp poverty of rural France in the early 20th century. A world of hard soil and harder lives. It was into this world that Christine Papin was born in 1905, followed by Léa in 1911. They were born into a family that was less a home and more a collection of resentments, held together by the thinnest of threads. Their father, Gustave Papin, was a man hollowed out by alcohol. His temper was a storm that could break at any moment, leaving devastation in its wake. He was a creature of loud, violent despair. Their mother, Clémence, was the opposite. Her cruelty was quiet, sharp, and cold. She was a woman who saw her children not as daughters, but as burdens. She saw them as mouths to feed, as mistakes to be endured. Love in the Papin household was a foreign currency they could not afford. From the very beginning, the world taught Christine and Léa a single brutal lesson. They were alone, and they could trust no one. Their early life was a blur of instability. They were shuffled between loveless homes and the cold, institutional arms of the church. Their older sister, Emilia, was sent away first. Clémence claimed she could not care for her. She was placed in the Bon Pasteur orphanage, a place of rigid discipline and enforced piety. The message was clear: you are not wanted here. Christine was next. For a time she lived with her paternal aunt. It was a brief respite, a small island of something resembling care, in an ocean of neglect. But it did not last. The family fractured completely. Clémence accused Gustave of a terrible crime, of violating their eldest daughter, Emilia. Whether it was true, or another one of Clémence's cruel manipulations, we will never know. But the accusation was enough. It shattered what little remained of their family. Gustave fled. Clémence was left with her 2 youngest daughters, Christine and Léa. and she resented them for it. At the age of 7, Christine, too, was sent away. She followed her sister Emilia to the Bon Pasteur orphanage in Le Mans. It was here, behind the high stone walls, under the watchful eyes of the nuns, that the architecture of her soul was truly built. The orphanage was a world of bells, prayers, and punishments. Silence was a virtue. Obedience was a law. The individual was erased, subsumed into the collective routine of scrubbing floors, reciting catechisms, and begging God for forgiveness for sins they were too young to understand. Christine learned to be quiet. She learned to be invisible. She learned to build walls inside her own mind, a place where no one could reach her. The outside world was cruel and unpredictable. But inside the world of rules and rituals, there was a kind of safety. A grim, colorless safety. Léa, the younger, the softer of the two, remained with her mother for a time. But she, too, was eventually cast off. She was passed to an uncle, who, it was said, finally demanded that Clémence take responsibility for her own child. And so, Léa was also sent behind the convent walls. The two sisters, separated for years, were finally reunited in this place of disciplined sorrow. And it was here, in the shared chill of the dormitory, in the whispered confessions after lights out, that their bond was forged. It was not just the bond of sisters, it was the bond of survivors. They were two pieces of the same shipwreck, clinging to each other in a vast, cold sea. They recognized in each other the same wounds, the same fears, the same deep, aching loneliness. Christine, the elder, became the protector. She was intelligent, proud, and possessed a quiet intensity that unnerved the nuns. She was a model student, diligent and efficient. But beneath the surface of her obedience, a powerful current of will was forming. She watched the world with dark, observant eyes, missing nothing. She saw the hypocrisy, the casual cruelty, the chasm between the pious words and the loveless actions. And she stored it all away. Léa was different. She was timid, more fragile. She looked to Christine for everything, for guidance, for strength, for permission to feel. Christine was her compass, her shield. In a world that had offered them nothing, they offered each other everything. They became a closed circuit, a two-person universe. Their older sister, Emilia, chose a different path. She found solace not in a sister, but in God. At 18, she announced her intention to become a nun. To Clémence, this was the ultimate betrayal. A nun took a vow of poverty. A nun sent no wages home. It was a selfish, useless choice in her eyes. She flew into a rage, forbidding it, but Emilia held firm. She entered the convent, severing her ties with the broken family and the cruel world they represented. Her departure left a void, and into that void, Christine and Léa poured all of their shared devotion. They were all that was left, just the two of them. When Christine was old enough to work, she was sent out into the world of domestic service. It was the only future available to a poor, uneducated girl from an orphanage. She was trained to be a maid, to be silent, to be efficient, to be a ghost in someone else's life. She worked in several households, learning the rhythm of servitude. The early mornings, the endless cleaning, the heavy laundry, the constant unspoken demand for deference. She learned to wear the mask of the perfect servant, her face a blank canvas upon which her employers could project their own comfort. But behind the mask, she was watching. She was learning the geography of power. She saw the casual entitlement of the wealthy, the way they moved through their own homes as if the people who cleaned them were simply part of the furniture. Léa followed the same path. When her time came, she too was sent into service. It was their destiny, a fate prescribed by their birth, their class, their gender. They were meant to spend their lives on their knees, scrubbing the floors of the rich. Their mother, Clémence, saw to it. She would collect their wages, leaving them with only a pittance. They were her assets, her investment. Their labor was her income. And so, the sisters worked. Separately at first, in different houses, in different towns. But they lived for the moments they could be together. The rare day off, the stolen hours where they could retreat back into their private world. In those moments, they were not maids. They were not orphans. They were just Christine and Léa. And that was enough. They spoke a language that no one else could understand. Not a language of words, but of glances, of gestures, of shared silences. They could communicate entire volumes with a single look. They knew each other's thoughts before they were spoken. They felt each other's anxieties as if they were their own. This silent communication was their armor. It protected them from the outside world, from the prying eyes of mistresses, from the clumsy intrusions of strangers. In a life where they had no privacy, no space to call their own, they created a sanctuary within themselves, a fortress of two. The world of 1920s and 30s. France was a world of rigid hierarchies. The bourgeoisie, the middle class, lived lives of comfortable order. They prized respectability above all else. Their homes were their castles, immaculate symbols of their status. And running these castles was an army of silence, anonymous servants, maids, cooks, scullions. They were essential, yet invisible. They were expected to see everything and say nothing, to know all the family secrets, but have none of their own. They slept in tiny, unheated attic rooms, euphemistically called les mansardes. They rose before the sun and went to bed long after the family had retired. Their lives were a relentless cycle of work, punctuated only by exhaustion. Christine and Léa were good at their jobs, too good. They were meticulous, obsessive in their cleanliness. Their work was not just a duty, it was a ritual. The polishing of silver, the waxing of floors, the starching of linen, these were acts of devotion. But who, or what, were they devoted to? Not their employers, not the house. They were devoted to a standard of perfection that existed only in their shared mind. An impossible standard that kept the chaos of the world at bay. Their shared obsession with cleanliness was a way of controlling their environment, of imposing order on a life that had always been disordered. It was another wall they built around themselves. If everything was perfect, if there was not a single speck of dust, then perhaps they could keep the ugliness, the memories, the fear from seeping in. But the silence was taking its toll. Years of unspoken resentment, of swallowed anger, of repressed desires, were simmering beneath the calm surface. They had been taught that their feelings did not matter. Their pain was irrelevant. Their only purpose was to serve. And so they buried it all, deep down. But buried things do not disappear. They fester. They mutate. They grow in the dark. And in the silent world of Christine and Léa Papin, something terrible was beginning to grow. A strange and poisonous flower, nurtured by isolation and fertilized by a love that knew no boundaries. A love that was about to demand a blood sacrifice. The quiet beginning was over. The silence was about to break. In 1926, a door opened. It was the door to number 6, Rue Bruyère, in the respectable city of Le Mans. It was the home of Monsieur René Lancelin, a retired solicitor, his wife Léonie, and their adult daughter Geneviève. They were looking for new maids, and through an agency, they found Christine and Léa Papin. It seemed a perfect arrangement. The Lancelins were pillars of the community. Their home was a monument to bourgeois propriety. They wanted servants who were discreet, hard-working, and above all, invisible. The Papin sisters, with their downcast eyes and quiet efficiency, were the perfect candidates. Christine was hired as the cook, Léa as the housemaid. For the first time, they would be able to work together, to live together, to inhabit the same silent world, under the same roof. They thought it was a sanctuary. It was a cage. The Lancelin house became their entire world. A 3-story universe of polished wood, heavy curtains, and stifling etiquette. Their life was governed by the clock, by the ringing of service bells, by the unspoken rules of a class system as rigid as iron. They would rise in the dark, in their small attic room, a cold, sparse space at the very top of the house, far removed from the warmth and comfort of the family's quarters below. It was their cell, their nest. It contained 2 simple beds, a small table, and a single window that looked out over the rooftops of Le Mans. This room was the only place that was truly theirs. And in this room, they were not servants. They were queen and subject, goddess and worshipper, Christine, the elder, the dominant one, and Léa, her devoted shadow. Their daily routine was a testament to their obsessive perfectionism. The house was not just clean, it was immaculate. Floors were polished until they reflected the light like dark water. Dust was not permitted to settle. Every object had its place, every surface gleamed. Madame Lancelin was a demanding mistress. She expected the highest standards. And the sisters, in their silent, shared ambition, exceeded them. They seemed to take a strange, fierce pride in their work. It was as if by perfecting the house, they were purifying themselves. By erasing every speck of dirt, they were erasing the filth of their own past, the shame of their poverty, the memory of their abandonment. But their perfection was a symptom of their sickness. It was a wall against the world. They spoke to no one. They had no friends. On their 1/2 day off each week, they did not go out to socialize, to meet other maids, to walk in the park. They would walk, arm in arm, to the local market, purchase what they needed, and then retreat immediately back to the sanctuary of their attic room. They were seen by the local shopkeepers, a strange, inseparable pair who moved as one. They never smiled. Their faces were blank masks. The world outside the Lancelin house did not exist for them. Other people were ghosts, phantoms in a world that was not their own. Their reality was confined to the 3 floors of that house, and the small, cold room at the top. Inside the house, the silence was even more profound. They rarely spoke to the Lancelins, beyond the necessary pleasantries of their station. "Yes, madame." "No, madame." Their voices were soft, barely whispers. They moved through the grand rooms like shadows, their footsteps muffled on the thick carpets. They were a constant silent presence. They saw and heard everything. The family arguments, the private conversations, the mundane details of a life they could never have. They were the keepers of the family's secrets, but they remained complete mysteries themselves. The Lancelins knew nothing about them. They did not know about the alcoholic father, the cold mother, the convent, the loneliness. They only knew that their maids were efficient, that the silver was always polished, that dinner was always on time. To the Lancelins, the Papin sisters were not human beings. They were functions. They were a pair of hands. The relationship between the sisters intensified in this enclosed environment. Their bond, already powerful, became absolute. They depended on each other for everything. Léa, in particular, became utterly subservient to Christine. She was an extension of Christine's will. She would not act, would not speak, would not even seem to think without Christine's approval. Christine was the brain. Léa was the hands. In the evenings, after their long day of labor was done, they would climb the narrow stairs to their attic room and lock the door. The world, with its demands and its judgments, was shut out. And in the privacy of that room, their strange, isolated love could flourish. It was a love that was possessive, jealous, and all-consuming. It was a love born of shared trauma. They had been abandoned by everyone, so they would never abandon each other. They had been unloved by the world, so they would pour all the love they had into one another. Their relationship had an intensity that bordered on the religious. They were a sect of 2. They performed their daily chores with the ritualistic fervor of nuns. The house was their temple, and its cleanliness was their form of prayer. But their God was not in heaven. Their God was in the room with them. For Léa, Christine was a deity. Her word was law. Her moods dictated the weather in their small world. And for Christine, Léa was her creation, her possession, her mirror, a reflection of herself, but softer, more pliable. Madame Lancelin, for her part, seemed content with her strange, silent servants. They were reliable. They caused no trouble. But there were moments, small fissures in the facade of their perfect service, that hinted at the pressure building beneath. Madame Lancelin was known to be a stickler for detail. She would sometimes run a white-gloved finger over a mantelpiece, checking for dust. A single overlooked speck could earn a cold reprimand. For most servants, this would be an annoyance. For Christine and Léa, it was a desecration. It was a judgment on their entire existence. A criticism from Madame was not just a comment on their work. It was an intrusion into their world, a violation of their sacred pact of perfection. They would receive these rebukes in silence, with their eyes cast down. But inside, the resentment was coiling, tightening like a spring. They had been in the house for years, years of the same routine, the same silence, the same four walls. The world outside changed. The economy faltered. Politics shifted. But inside the Lancelin house, time stood still. The seasons turned, marked only by the changing menus and the different chores required. Winter meant hauling coal for the fireplaces. Spring meant airing out the heavy curtains. Summer meant long, hot hours in the kitchen, canning fruits. Autumn meant sweeping fallen leaves. Year after year. The same tasks, the same silence, the same two faces in the mirror. Their isolation was complete. They were like two plants growing in a sealed jar, feeding on the same stale air. Their roots tangled together so tightly that they could no longer be told apart. There were whispers among the other servants in the neighborhood. The Papin girls were odd. They kept to themselves. They were too proud, too quiet. They seemed to look down on everyone else. But no one could fault their work. The Lancelin house was known as the best-kept home on the Rue Bruyère. This reputation only served to isolate them further. They were not part of the community of maids. They were a class apart, defined by their eerie self-sufficiency and their silent devotion to their work. The relationship between the sisters and their employers was a perfect storm of misunderstanding. The Lancelins saw two quiet, efficient maids. They saw obedience and deference. They did not see the rage brewing behind Christine's dark eyes. They did not see the terror in Léa's soul. They did not understand that the sisters' silence was not a sign of contentment. It was the calm surface of a deep, volcanic lake. The Lancelins, like so many of their class, viewed their servants as simple creatures, untroubled by the complex emotions of their betters. They were content as long as their needs were met. It was a fatal miscalculation. They had no idea that in their attic, a private reality was being constructed, a reality with its own laws, its own morality, its own God. And in that reality, the Lancelins were not benevolent masters. They were tyrants. They were jailers. They were the embodiment of all the humiliation and neglect the sisters had ever suffered. Every order, every criticism, every condescending glance was another brick in the wall of their hatred. For 7 years they served in silence, 7 years of scrubbing, polishing, and cooking, 7 years of absorbing the subtle and overt humiliations of their station, 7 years of their shared world growing smaller and more intense, until the Lancelin house was all that existed. Their love for each other was the only light in their dark world. But it was a strange, consuming light. A light that blinded them. A light that cast long, distorted shadows. In their attic room, they would lie in bed, whispering to each other in the dark, recounting the day's tiny slights, reinforcing their shared paranoia. The world was against them. Everyone was against them. Only they could be trusted. Only they were pure. They were the saints, and the world was full of sinners, and their mistresses with their soft hands and their demanding eyes, were the greatest sinners of all. The pressure was building, the silence was stretched taut, like a wire, and soon, something would have to snap. The change was subtle at first, a slight shift in the atmosphere of the house, a new tension in the air, so faint that the Lancelins, wrapped in the comfortable cotton of their own lives, did not notice it. But it was there. The sisters' silence, once merely deferential, now seemed heavier, charged with something unspoken. It was the silence of a held breath, the silence before a storm. Christine, once so self-contained, began to exhibit a strange new arrogance. Her movements became more deliberate, her posture more rigid. There were moments when she would meet Madame Lancelin's gaze for a fraction of a second too long, a flicker of something dark and defiant in her eyes before she looked away. It was a small rebellion, but a significant one. The mask of the perfect servant was beginning to crack. Léa, in turn, seemed to shrink. She became more fearful, more dependent on Christine than ever. She would startle at the slightest noise, her eyes constantly darting towards her older sister, seeking reassurance. She developed mysterious fainting spells, collapsing without warning, only to be revived by a frantic, ministering Christine. Were these spells real, or were they a performance for an audience of two, a way of reinforcing their roles? Christine the strong, Léa the weak. Christine the protector, Léa the one who needed protecting. These episodes bound them even closer together. Christine would carry Léa to their room, lock the door, and nurse her back to health, shutting out the concerned and slightly annoyed Lancelins. Their shared sickness was a private ritual, a sacrament that excluded the outside world. There were other signs. Strange arguments would erupt between the sisters, loud enough to be overheard by the family below. The cause was always unclear, a muffled storm of emotion from the top of the house. But these arguments would end as suddenly as they began, followed by an even deeper, more profound silence. It was as if their shared world was becoming unstable, rocked by internal pressures that no one else could understand. They were a system in crisis, turning in on itself. Christine once had a conversation with a neighbor, a rare breach of their self-imposed isolation. She spoke of wanting to leave service, of wanting a different life, but then she added with a strange finality that she could never leave her sister. "I am waiting for her," she said. It was a cryptic remark. Waiting for what? For Léa to be old enough? Or for something else? A sign? A catalyst? A final, irrevocable breaking point? The Lancelins were not entirely oblivious. They noticed the sisters' increasing oddness. Monsieur Lancelin, in a moment of paternalistic concern, once suggested that perhaps the girls needed to get out more, to make friends. He encouraged them to join a local club. Christine's response was swift and cold. "We have no need of anyone but ourselves." The door to their world, which had been slightly ajar, was slammed shut. The family was unnerved. They began to speak of letting the sisters go, finding new maids, a pair less strange, less intense. But they hesitated. The Papins were such excellent workers. The house had never been run so perfectly. And so, they did nothing. They let the strange atmosphere in their home fester, unaware that they were living on a fault line. The city of Le Mans itself was a pressure cooker. France was in the grip of economic depression and political turmoil. There was a palpable tension between the classes. The wealthy bourgeoisie, like the Lancelins, clung to their ordered lives, while the working class seethed with resentment. The newspapers were full of stories of struggle, of strikes, of the widening gulf between the haves and the have-nots. The Papin sisters, isolated as they were not immune to this. They were the living embodiment of that class divide. Every day, they cleaned and cooked for a family whose comfort was built on their labor. They polished the silver they would never eat with, made the beds they would never sleep in, and enabled a life of leisure they could never imagine for themselves. This daily, intimate contact with the symbols of their own oppression must have been a constant, grinding source of humiliation. They were not just maids. They were a mirror reflecting the Lancelins' privilege, and the reflection they saw was one of their own subjugation. Then came the incident with the iron. It was, on the surface, a trivial matter, a household appliance, but it would become the trigger, the spark that ignited the pyre. An electrical fault in the house had caused the iron to short-circuit while Léa was pressing clothes. The power went out. A fuse had blown. It was a simple, mundane accident. But in the hypercharged, paranoid world of the Papin sisters, it was a catastrophe. It was a failure, a flaw in their perfect system. They knew Madame Lancelin would be angry, not just about the iron, but about the disruption, the imperfection. They imagined her cold, critical eyes, her disappointed voice. In their minds, this small accident became a monumental crime, and they were the guilty party. The day was Thursday, February 2nd, 1933. It was the sisters' half-day off, but they had stayed in to finish the ironing. Monsieur Lancelin was out for the evening at a dinner with his brother. Madame Lancelin and her daughter Geneviève had gone out shopping and were due to return around 6:30. The sisters were alone in the darkening house. The broken iron sat on the board, a symbol of their failure. The blown fuse plunged the house into an anxious gloom. They managed to reset some of the lights, but the iron was dead. They waited. They knew a confrontation was coming. The house grew colder, darker. The ticking of the grandfather clock on the landing seemed to grow louder, each tick a hammer blow of approaching doom. What happened in those hours of waiting, alone in the silent house? We can only imagine. Did they speak? Or did they communicate in their usual silent way, their shared anxiety growing with each passing minute? Christine, the leader, the strategist, would have been thinking, planning. But planning for what? An apology? An excuse? Or something else entirely? They were trapped by their own impossible standards, trapped by their fear of their mistress, trapped in a life they had not chosen. The pressure that had been building for 7 years, for their entire lives, was now concentrated on this one point in time. The broken iron, the impending return of Madame Lancelin, the confrontation they could not escape. At around 6:30, they heard the key in the lock. The Lancelin women had returned. The sound of the front door opening was like a death knell. Madame Lancelin and Geneviève stepped into the hall, shaking the rain from their coats. They called out. The house was quiet, too quiet. Madame Lancelin ascended the stairs. She found Léa on the landing. The confrontation began. "What is this?" Madame Lancelin asked, her voice sharp. "Why are the lights not working properly? What has happened now?" Her tone was one of weary exasperation. To her, it was just another instance of incompetence, another annoyance in her well-ordered day. She could not know that she was not speaking to her maid. She was speaking to a creature pushed to the very edge of its sanity. She was prodding a caged animal that had been starved and beaten for years. The exact words that were exchanged are lost to history. But we know the outcome. According to the sisters' later confession, this was the moment the world broke open. Léa, terrified, began to explain about the iron. Christine, hearing the confrontation from the top of the stairs, began to descend. She saw her sister, her other half, being berated. She saw the face of her mistress, contorted with anger. And in that moment, she saw not just Madame Lancelin, but every person who had ever hurt them. She saw her cold mother. She saw the stern nuns. She saw the entire oppressive weight of the world that had tried to crush them. And something inside her, something that had been coiled tight for 28 years, finally snapped. She launched herself at Madame Lancelin. It was not a calculated attack. It was a primal scream of rage, given physical form. She lunged forward, and with a terrifying strength, she gouged at Madame Lancelin's eyes with her thumbs. The act was so sudden, so savage, It was beyond comprehension. Geneviève, the daughter, rushed to her mother's aid, fighting back, pulling at Christine's hair. Léa, seeing her sister in a struggle, joined the fray. The pact was absolute. An attack on one was an attack on both. The quiet landing of the respectable bourgeois home was transformed into a scene of unimaginable horror. The years of silence, of repression, of swallowed rage, exploded. It was no longer a confrontation between mistress and maid. It was a war. A war that had been raging silently within the sisters' minds for years, now made terrifyingly real. The breaking point had been reached, and the night was just beginning. The landing became an abattoir. The carefully constructed civility of the Lancelin home was ripped apart in a frenzy of violence that defied all reason. This was not a murder for gain or passion in the conventional sense. It was an exorcism, an eruption. Christine and Léa, who for years had moved with the quiet grace of shadows, now became forces of pure, brutal destruction. As Christine clawed at Madame Lancelin's face, screaming for Léa to smash her head in, the younger sister, the timid Léa, obeyed. She grabbed a heavy pewter pot that sat on a small table, a decorative object, and brought it down with crushing force on Geneviève's head. The sound of the impact, the sickening crunch of bone, was the first note in a symphony of carnage. Geneviève fell. Léa then turned her attention to Madame Lancelin, who was still locked in a desperate struggle with Christine. Léa struck her too, again and again, with the pot. The Lancelin women were no match for the sisters' explosive rage. They were stunned, overwhelmed by the suddenness and ferocity of the attack. They had lived their lives insulated from such raw animalistic violence. They could not comprehend what was happening. Their maids, their quiet, subservient maids, had become monsters. The struggle spilled across the landing. The sisters dragged their victims, now barely conscious, battering them against the floor, the walls, the elegant wooden staircase. Their repressed hatred, stored up over a lifetime of servitude and humiliation, poured out of them in a torrent of blows. But the pewter pot was not enough. The rage demanded more. Christine ran down to the kitchen. She returned with a hammer and a large knife. The pewter pot had been an instrument of blunt force, of rage. These new tools were instruments of mutilation. They returned to the landing. The two women lay bleeding, groaning, but still alive. The sister, or as now began a systematic and horrifying dismantling of their employers. They used the hammer to crush their skulls. They used the knife to slash and cut their faces, their legs, their bodies. They seemed to focus their attack on the women's eyes. As Christine had confessed later, I tore out her eyes so that she could not see me. It was a deeply symbolic act. They were blinding the source of the critical, judgmental gaze that had scrutinized their lives for 7 years. They were destroying the very organs of their oppression. In the midst of this frenzy, there was a strange, chilling moment of ritual. After they had finished with Madame Lancelin, they turned their full attention to the daughter, Geneviève. As if performing some dark, forgotten rite, they lifted her skirt and began to slash at her thighs and buttocks with the knife. The cuts were deep, laid open to the bone. This act, so specific and so bizarre, baffled psychologists and criminologists for years. Was it a symbolic act of sexual violation, a twisted reversal of the power dynamics they had always known? Was it a furious attack on the Lancelin family's future, on the daughter who represented the continuation of their privileged line? Or was it simply the random, meaningless byproduct of a shared psychotic breakdown? We will never know. It remains one of the most disturbing and inscrutable details of the crime. The violence lasted for perhaps half an hour, but in that time, the sisters had vented a lifetime of fury. When it was over, the landing was a sea of blood. The bodies of Léonie and Geneviève Lancelin were barely recognizable as human. Their faces were pulp. Their bodies were a canvas of cuts and bruises. Their eyes, gouged from their sockets, had been placed, with a strange deliberate care, on the carpeted stairs. The sisters stood amidst the carnage, breathing heavily. They were covered in the blood of their victims. The war was over. They had won, and then a profound, eerie calm descended upon them. The frenzy was gone, replaced by the quiet efficiency they had perfected over years of service. Their work was not yet done. They methodically began to clean up. Not the crime scene itself, that was left as a testament, but themselves and their tools. They took the hammer, the knife, and the bloodied pewter pot to the kitchen sink and washed them carefully, rinsing away all traces of the horror. They then went upstairs to their small attic room. They took off their soiled clothes. They washed themselves, scrubbing their skin clean of the lanceline blood. Then naked, they climbed into their shared bed. They bolted the door of their room. They bolted the main door of the house from the inside. And then, in the darkness, they waited. They had retreated back into their fortress. They had pulled up the drawbridge. The world and the consequences of what they had done could not reach them there. Downstairs, the house was silent once more. But it was a new kind of silence. A heavy, morbid silence, thick with the smell of death. The grandfather clock continued its steady, indifferent ticking, marking the passage of time in a house where time had stopped. Outside, the rain continued to fall on the Rue Bruyère. At around 7:30, Monsieur Lancelin arrived home. He found the house dark and locked. He called out for his wife, his daughter. There was no answer. He tried the door, but it was bolted from within. This was unusual. His wife and daughter were always home at this hour. The maids were always there to open the door. He felt a prickle of unease. He walked around the house, checking the windows. All were dark, except for one. A single faint light glowed from the attic. The maid's room. His unease grew into alarm. He went to his in-laws who lived nearby, and then to the police station. He returned with a police officer. Together, they tried to force the door, but it held firm. The officer decided to break in through a back entrance with the help of a locksmith. When they finally stepped inside, the darkness and the silence were absolute. They called out again. Madame Lancelin? Geneviève? Only the echo of their own voices answered. As they moved through the ground floor with a flashlight, everything seemed to be in its place. The polished furniture, the neat stacks of magazines, a scene of perfect domestic tranquility. But then they started up the stairs. The beam of the flashlight cut through the gloom, and the horror revealed itself. The officer who saw it first would be haunted by the image for the rest of his life. The landing was a slaughterhouse. He saw the two bodies, twisted and broken, lying in a pool of congealing blood. He saw the gore splattered on the walls, reaching almost to the ceiling. And then, in a detail so grotesque it seemed impossible, he saw the eyes. Lying there, separate from the bodies they belonged to. The scene was so brutal, so savage, that the initial assumption was that it must have been the work of a crazed vagrant, a madman who had broken into the house. No one could imagine who else could be capable of such a thing. The police searched the rest of the house. They found the upstairs rooms empty. Finally, they came to the maid's room at the top of the house. The door was locked from the inside. They knocked. "Open up! Police!" There was no answer. They broke the door down. The scene that greeted them was surreal, dreamlike. In the flickering light of a single candle, on a neatly made bed, two young women were lying huddled together. They were naked. They were Christine and Léa Papin. There was no blood on them. They were clean. They seemed to be sleeping. On a chair nearby lay the murder weapons, washed and placed side by side. The hammer, or the knife, the pot. The police commissioner, who had been called to the scene, entered the room. He approached the bed. He asked them what had happened. He expected a story of a break-in, of a terrifying intruder. He did not expect the answer he received. It was Christine who spoke. Her voice was flat, devoid of emotion. She looked at the commissioner with her dark, unreadable eyes. "We did it," she said. There was no hesitation, no remorse, just a simple, chilling statement of fact. She then recounted the events of the evening in a calm, lucid monologue, with Léa occasionally adding a detail, her voice a quiet echo of her sister's. They confessed to everything: the argument, the attack, the mutilation. They described it all with a terrifying detachment, as if they were describing a particularly difficult day of spring cleaning. They had done their work, and now they were resting. The crime that would stun all of France had found its authors. And they were not madmen or intruders. They were the two quiet maids who had served in silence for 7 long years. The silence was broken, and its sound was the sound of a skull being crushed. The news of the crime on the Rue Bruyère spread through Le Mans like a contagion. It was a story that seemed to crawl out of the darkest pages of a Gothic novel and into the mundane reality of a provincial French city. The sheer brutality of the act, committed by 2 seemingly meek and unremarkable domestic servants, was beyond public comprehension. It was a story that fed on the deepest anxieties of the bourgeoisie, the fear of the enemy within, the sudden violent uprising of the servant class against their masters. The Papin sisters were no longer Christine and Léa. They became the monsters of Le Mans. Their faces, captured in stark police photographs, stared out from the front pages of newspapers across the country. Christine, with her intense, defiant gaze, Léa with her frightened, bewildered expression, her eyes still seeking her sister's even in the flash of the camera. Their trial became a national spectacle. It was more than just a murder trial. It was a public dissection of French society. It became a battleground for competing ideologies. For the political left, the surrealists, and the intellectuals, the sisters were not monsters. They were tragic heroines, proletarian saints. They were the inevitable products of a cruel and exploitative class system. Their violent act was seen as a righteous, if terrifying, act of rebellion. The philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre and the writer Simone de Beauvoir saw in their crime a form of existential liberation, a desperate attempt to reclaim their humanity through an act of supreme violence. The surrealists celebrated the crime's dreamlike quality, its irrational, explosive beauty. They saw it as an assault on the suffocating logic of bourgeois reality. The sisters were transformed into symbols, their crime a bloody poem about class warfare and the horrors of repression. For the right-wing press and the conservative establishment, the explanation was simpler. The sisters were degenerates. They were products of bad blood, of a corrupt lineage tainted by alcoholism and madness. Their crime was not a political act, but an explosion of pure, motiveless evil. Doctors and alienists, as psychiatrists were then known, were called to testify, offering a bewildering array of diagnoses. Was it a classic case of folie à deux, a shared psychotic disorder where a dominant personality imposes their delusion on a more submissive one? Was it the result of a repressed, incestuous homosexual relationship, a theory that both scandalized and fascinated the public? Or was it simply a case of inherited madness, a ticking time bomb in their genes that was destined to explode? The trial itself was a somber affair. The sisters, dressed in black, sat together in the dock, impassive and silent. They seemed detached from the proceedings, as if the trial was about 2 other people. They remained in their private world, communicating with glances and tiny, imperceptible gestures. When asked to speak, it was Christine who did the talking. Her testimony was chilling in its lucidity. She described the murders without emotion, accepting full responsibility. "I would rather have had the skin of my masters than have them have mine," she famously declared, a statement that was seized upon by those who saw the crime as an act of class revenge. Léa barely spoke. She simply echoed her sister. "Yes, I did everything my sister told me to do," she whispered. Her loyalty was absolute, even in the face of judgment. The prosecution painted them as calculating, cruel monsters. The defense argued for insanity, portraying them as victims of a lifetime of abuse and a toxic symbiotic relationship that had driven them mad. The key question was their state of mind. Were they legally sane at the time of the murders? 3 court-appointed psychiatrists examined them and came to a conclusion that sealed their fate. They found the sisters to be sane. They suffered from no recognized psychosis. They were, in the eyes of the law, fully responsible for their actions. The verdict was swift. Léa, seen as the follower, the weaker of the two, was sentenced to 10 years of hard labor. Christine, the leader, the instigator, was sentenced to death by the guillotine. Upon hearing the sentence, Christine collapsed. But it was not her own fate that undid her. She broke down when she heard that she would be separated from her sister. For the first time, she showed emotion. She begged the court, "Don't take my sister from me." Her plea was ignored. The 2 sisters, who had lived as one person for so long, were torn apart. The separation was a psychological death sentence for Christine. In prison, deprived of Léa, her other half, her mirror, she began to disintegrate. Her proud, defiant demeanor crumbled, replaced by a deep, inconsolable grief. She refused to eat. She would cry out for her sister in the night. She engaged in acts of self-mutilation, trying to tear out her own eyes, just as she had done to her victims. It was a horrifying echo of her crime. A sign that the violence she had unleashed on the world was now turning inward. Her death sentence was later commuted to life imprisonment with hard labor, but it made no difference. She was transferred to a mental asylum in Rennes. Her madness, which the court had refused to recognize, now consumed her completely. She would often lie in a fetal position, speaking to no one, wasting away. In 1937, just 4 years after the crime, Léa Papin died of cachexia, a wasting syndrome brought on by self-starvation. She had refused to live in a world without her sister. Léa's fate was quieter, more mysterious. She served her sentence, reportedly as a model prisoner. She was quiet, obedient, and withdrawn. In 1943, after serving 8 years of her 10-year sentence, she was released early for good behavior. And then, she vanished. She was given a new identity and went to live with her mother Clémence, the woman who had abandoned her as a child. What kind of life did they have together? Did they ever speak of Christine? Did Léa ever feel remorse, or guilt, or fear? We don't know. Léa Papin slipped back into the silence from which she had come. She became a ghost. For decades, her ultimate fate was a mystery. Rumors circulated. Some said she died shortly after her release. Others said she entered a convent seeking to atone for her sins. It was not until the early 2000s that a French filmmaker, Claude Ventura, finally uncovered the truth. After an exhaustive search, he found her death certificate. Léa Papin had lived a long, quiet life. She had worked as a hotel maid in the town of Nantes under an assumed name. She had lived with her mother until Clémence's death, and then continued to live alone, a solitary, anonymous figure. She never married. She had no children. She died of natural causes in 1982. Some sources claim she died as late as 2001, but the 1982 date is more commonly cited by researchers. She had managed to live for nearly 50 years after the crime, wrapped in a cloak of obscurity. Did she ever think about that terrible night on the Rue Bruyère? Did the ghosts of Léonie and Geneviève Lancelin ever visit her in her dreams? Or had she, through some feat of psychological self-preservation, buried the memory so deep that it could no longer touch her? The quiet, timid girl who had followed her sister into an act of unspeakable violence had managed to do what Christine could not. She survived. She lived out her days in silence, a walking, breathing secret, the final unanswered question in a story that continues to horrify and fascinate. The aftermath of the Papin sisters' case was not just about their personal fates. It was about the shockwaves it sent through society. The crime forced a comfortable, complacent France to look at the ugliness beneath its polished surface. It exposed the brutal realities of class, the hidden traumas of family, and the terrifying fragility of the human mind. It raised questions that are still being debated today. What is the nature of evil? Is it born, or is it made? How much pressure can a human soul endure before it shatters? And what happens when two people, locked in a love that is also a prison, decide that the only way to save their world is to destroy ours? The trial was over, the sisters were gone, but the story was just beginning. The story of Christine and Léa Papin did not end with their trial or with their deaths. It seeped into the cultural consciousness of France and then the world, transforming from a sordid news item into a potent and terrifying myth. The sisters became archetypes, their crime a dark parable that could be endlessly reinterpreted. They were no longer just two maids from Le Mans. They were a symbol of the explosive potential of a life lived in silence and servitude. Their legacy is not one of justice or resolution, but of a lingering, profound fear. A fear of what lies hidden behind the closed doors of an ordinary house and behind the placid masks of ordinary people. Almost immediately, their case was claimed by artists and intellectuals who saw in its horror a kind of terrible truth. The most famous and enduring interpretation came from the playwright Jean Genet. In 1947, he wrote The Maids, Les Bonnes, a play directly inspired by the Papin case. In Genet's claustrophobic ritualistic drama, two sisters, Claire and Solange, are maids who engage in elaborate role-playing games in their mistress's absence. They take turns playing the mistress, dressing in her clothes, mimicking her voice, and acting out their fantasies of domination and murder. The play is a labyrinth of identity, power, and illusion. It captures the psychological core of the Papin sisters' story, the way their shared world became more real, more potent than reality itself. Genet understood that the crime was not just a physical act, but the culmination of a long, elaborate, and deadly performance. He transformed the brutal, bloody reality of the crime into a piece of high art that explores the complex, poisoned relationship between servant and master, love and hate, reality and fantasy. The story's appeal to filmmaking was also immediate and powerful. Numerous films have been made about the sisters, each offering a different lens through which to view their story. In 1995, Claude Chabrol, a master of the French psychological thriller, directed La Cérémonie. While not a direct adaptation, it is heavily influenced by the Papin case, transposing the story to a contemporary setting. It explores the simmering class resentment and the strange, intense bond that forms between an illiterate, isolated housekeeper and a rebellious, anti-bourgeois postal worker. The film brilliantly captures the slow, inexorable buildup of tension, the way small slights and humiliations accumulate until they explode into violence. It shows how the Papin sisters' story is not locked in the 1930s, but is a timeless tale of social and psychological combustion. Another notable film, Jean-Pierre Denis' murderous maids, Les Blessures Assassines, from 2000, offers a more direct and psychologically grounded account of Christine and Léa's lives. The film meticulously recreates their bleak childhood, their time in the convent, and the suffocating atmosphere of the Lancelin household. It focuses on the intense, almost unbearable intimacy of the sisters' relationship, suggesting a powerful, incestuous bond that becomes the engine of their shared madness. The film refuses to sensationalize the crime, instead presenting it as the tragic, inevitable outcome of a lifetime of trauma and isolation. It makes the viewer feel the claustrophobia of their existence, the slow tightening of the psychological vice that would eventually crush them and everyone around them. Beyond theater and film, the Papin sisters have become a case study in psychology, sociology, and feminist theory. For psychologists, they remain the definitive, if terrifying, example of folie à deux, or shared psychosis. Their case demonstrates how a closed, isolated dyad can create its own reality, a shared delusion that is impervious to outside influence. The dominant partner, Christine, creates the delusional framework, and the submissive partner, Léa, adopts it as her own, until their individual identities merge into a single pathological unit. Their story is a chilling reminder of the power of human connection and how that power, when twisted and corrupted, can lead to monstrous outcomes. For sociologists and historians, the case is a stark illustration of the brutal class dynamics of early 20th century Europe. It is a story about the invisibility of labor, the dehumanization of the working class, and the way social structures can inflict a kind of slow, grinding violence on those at the bottom. The sisters' explosion of rage is seen not as an isolated act of madness, but as a symptom of a sick society, a society that created the conditions for such a horror to occur. They were maids, a profession that demanded total self-effacement. Their crime was a terrifying, bloody assertion of self, a declaration that they existed, that they felt, and that their pain mattered. Feminist scholars have also found fertile ground in the Papin sisters' story. They have been interpreted as victims of a patriarchal society that offered them no agency, no escape, and no voice. Their lives were dictated by their gender and their class. Their bodies were not their own. They were instruments of labor for their masters. Their crime, particularly the symbolic mutilation of the Lancelin women, has been read as a furious, desperate rebellion against the female figures who enforced the patriarchal order, the cruel mother, the stern nuns, the demanding mistress. Their intense, exclusive love for each other can be seen as a radical rejection of a heterosexual world that had only ever offered them pain and exploitation. In their tragic, twisted way, they created a female-centric world, a fortress of two against a hostile, male-dominated society. But beneath all these complex interpretations, the raw, elemental power of the story remains. It is a story that touches on our most primal fears, the fear of losing our identity, of being consumed by another person, the fear of the madness that might lurk just beneath the surface of our own minds, the fear of the stranger we let into our homes. The Papin sisters breached the most sacred of boundaries, the one between the upstairs and the downstairs, the master and the servant, the public face and the private rage. They showed that the people who polish our silver and make our beds have inner lives as complex and tumultuous as our own, and that when those inner lives are sufficiently damaged, they can become deadly. Their legacy is a haunting question mark. Were they monsters or victims, sane or insane, political rebels or pathological killers? The truth is, they were likely all of these things at once. Their story resists easy categorization. It is a tangled knot of love, hate, madness, and social injustice. And that is why it endures. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that the line between victim and perpetrator is sometimes terrifyingly thin. It reminds us that silence is never empty. It is filled with unspoken words, unexpressed emotions, and sometimes a rage that is building, waiting for the right moment to break free. The house at number 6, Rue Bruyère, no longer exists as it was. But the story born within its walls is immortal. It is whispered in criminology classes, debated in university seminars, and recreated on stages and screens around the world. It is a modern folktale, a cautionary story about the darkness that can grow in the quietest of places. The story of Christine and Léa Papin is a testament to the fact that the most terrifying monsters are not the ones who lurk in the shadows of our imagination. They are the ones who suffer in silence, right in front of our eyes, until one day, they simply cannot be silent any longer. And their breaking of that silence is a sound that, once heard, can never be forgotten. It is the sound of a world coming apart,